I thought this day couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. It had been bad all week at work, and to top it off, my boss, the president of the company, called me into his office and reprimanded me for a mistake someone else had made. When I arrived home, I found my driveway blocked by my sister-in-law's car. I couldn't even park in front of my own house. The neighbor's teenage son must have had a gathering of friends. Cars were parked along the curb on both sides of their house. I had to park 3 houses away. I didn't even know why I was going to this house. My wife's sister Susan and I hadn't gotten along from the first day we met. I never understood why, but she seemed to hate me at first sight, and I didn't think I'd have any luck that night. I hadn't had sex with my wife Janice in almost a month, not for lack of trying on my part. When I reached my driveway, I noticed an empty dumpster at the curb, walked around the house and through the side gate. I set the container next to the back door and made my way into the kitchen. Music was playing in the living room, and I could hear my wife and her sister talking. I reached into the refrigerator and pulled out a beer. Unscrewing the lid, I took a big sip of the cold beer and headed into the living room. Just as I reached the door, I heard a phrase that made me freeze in place. God, we had sex 3 times today. It was not my sister-in-law's voice, but my loving wife's. I had never met Brandon, but I knew that was the name of my wife's ex-boyfriend who left her and moved away. "So what are you going to do now?" my wife's sister asked. "Brandon wants me to move in with him, so I'll get a lawyer and file for divorce," Janice replied. "It's a community property state, so I'll get half of everything." I'd heard enough. Numbly, I walked to the back door and headed for my car. I opened the door and got behind the wheel. Now I realized why I wasn't having sex. My wife was giving herself to someone else. Now she wanted half of everything. Worst of all, the state would give it to her. Janice and I had only been married for 3 years. She quit her job right after we said I do to each other. When she was home, she never lifted a finger. I paid for a maid who came 3 times a week, cleaned the house, and did the laundry. On those days, she even cooked dinner for us. The rest of the time, either I cooked or she ordered food. I know what you're thinking, but I was in love in more glasses. Don't get me wrong. She made me happy by providing good sex. That was until a month ago. My mother died when I was 13 years old. My father and I were crushed. She was the center of our lives. It was hard at first, but over time we were able to deal with the loss and move on with our lives. My father did his best to raise me right, and I think he did a pretty good job of it. We were very close, and it was a big blow to me when I lost him to the recklessness of a drunk driver. It happened when I was 23, a year before I met Janice. My father left everything to me. I inherited about $2.5 million. Quite a decent sum, but not that much in these days of .com millionaires. I never touched that money, preferring to keep it in investments. With the advice of a good broker, I was able to make my nest egg grow even in the current economy. I was earning enough to keep my money from going to waste. And despite Janice trying to spend every dime I earned, I still had another $100,000 in savings. I was in love with Janice, and we didn't have a prenup. Like many men, I was naive enough to think my marriage would last forever. That mistake resulted in her being able to take almost $1.5 million from me. And for what? For spreading her legs? And the state will give it to her. Talk about supporting legalized prostitution. She said she was going to hire a lawyer, which meant she wasn't ready to serve me with a subpoena yet. I still had time to act. Sitting in my car, I began to formulate a plan. While I was thinking, I kept my eyes on the rear-view mirror and waited until I saw my sister-in-law's car pull away. I started the car, made a U-turn, and backed into my driveway. When I entered the house, Janice was no longer in sight, so I went into the kitchen to get a beer. I uncorked the cap and took another long sip. "Oh, there you are, honey," Janice said as she entered the kitchen. "I didn't hear you come in." "Hi, honey. Just got home." "It's been a long day," I replied with a loving smile on my face. I wanted to show her that I could be as good an actor as she was. "I didn't have time to order anything for dinner," she said, pouting slightly. "I wanted to say that's because you spent the day having sex with your boyfriend and telling your sister about it." To which I replied, "It's okay, honey. I'm just reheating the leftovers from last night." Janice smiled sweetly at me, came over and kissed me on the cheek. "I'm going to go upstairs and soak in a hot bath," she said. I smiled and nodded. When she left, I pulled out a box of fried rice and ate it cold, washing it down with 2 more cups of beer. I tossed the empty container into the trash can and went into the room to sit in a chair. After flipping through 30 channels, I settled on an old John Wayne Western. A half hour later, Janice came back and sat on the couch until the movie was over. She got up and said she was tired and was going to bed. Yeah, sure. Sick of being a goddamn cheating whore. I told her affectionately that I was going to watch the news and then I'd get up. I didn't actually watch the movie. My mind was busy wondering what I was going to do. I knew I couldn't do anything until Monday morning, so I just had to survive the next few days. Saturday, I did yard work, and Sunday, I played golf with a couple of good buddies that I will miss. On Monday, I called my broker who handled my inherited portfolio and asked him to liquidate everything. One of the upsides of working in senior management was that I could cash out my 401k quickly. To hell with the penalties. By Thursday, I was ready to make my move. I went home to my beloved wife and told her that an emergency had arisen and I was leaving tomorrow on company business and would probably be gone for a week. I packed 2 suitcases. That was all I was going to take with me. When we moved into this house, I put away everything that was important to me in the closet. It didn't fit in with her decor, so I didn't want anything else. She chose the furniture and I didn't care about it. It was also a good thing we were renting a house, so I didn't have any money in it. I had recently sold my condo and we were looking for the right house to buy. When I say right, I mean right in her opinion. So far, the houses we were looking at just didn't fit. Friday morning, I kissed my wife on the cheek for the last time and carried the suitcases out the door. I loaded them into my Lexus and drove off, never looking back. The first thing I did was check in with my old buddy Jake, whom I trusted implicitly. He was shocked when I told him I wanted to trade the title for his old but restored 4-wheel drive car. I told him my intentions and confidence, and within an hour, I was on my way west. I doubted anyone would connect me to the car, and Jake said he would keep the car. I traded him in the garage for a while out of sight. For the next 4 days, I paid with cash as needed. I canceled all of our credit cards and left no paper trail. Most of my money was now safely tucked away in an offshore account with the help of my broker. I had an established system with him to transfer funds when needed. I had enough cash stashed in my SUV to last me for a while. The nights alone in motels were the worst. For the past week, I'd been too busy putting my plan into action to think about what had happened to me personally. I loved Janice. I wouldn't have married her otherwise. I ran through what-if scenarios in my head, but in the end, I decided there was little I could have done differently. Even if I knew her ex-boyfriend was back, I don't think I could have separated them. I came to 2 conclusions. The first is that I don't think she really loved me. I was just a ticket to dinner. 2, it was my own fault for being stupid enough to marry her. It was my 5th day away from home, and I was sitting in a mom-and-pop diner in a small town in Montana. I wondered what my beloved wife was doing, for surely she must have learned by now that all her credit cards had been canceled and our bank account was empty. My musings were interrupted by an elderly couple sitting at a neighboring table. Even though they were talking quietly, I could overhear what they were saying. The man was telling the woman, who was obviously his wife, that he would like to hire another worker. The problem was that until the calves were ready for sale, they could not afford to hire anyone. But even then, there were no willing workers for the amount they could pay. By my estimation, the man was in his late 50s. Although he was mostly gray now, you could tell he'd been born with dark hair. His wife was a striking red-haired woman with crystal blue eyes. After finishing the last bite, I stood up and walked over to their table. "I apologize for eavesdropping on your conversation, but perhaps I can help you," I said. The older man gave me an appraising look. "I don't see how you can do that. If you heard what we talked about, you know I can't pay you anything." "How about I just need a place to sleep in exchange for my labor?" I asked. His eyes narrowed. Colin excused us for a moment while I talked to that young man outside. He stood up and waited for me to follow him. Once we were in the parking lot where no one could hear us, he turned to me. I figured he was about my height, 6 feet. His shoulders were broad, and he didn't seem to have an ounce of fat on him. His face was what women would consider rough-looking, and it showed wrinkles from years of working outdoors in the sun. His eyes were dark brown and almost piercing when they looked at me. "Who the hell are you? Are you part of this Wilson gang?" he spat out. I defended myself by raising my hands. Wait a minute, mister. I don't know anything about any Wilsons. I was living in Texas 4 days ago, and I just got here this morning. I just thought we could help each other out. If what you say is true, why do you want to help us? I can't afford to pay you. What's in it for you? If you're hiding from the law, we don't want that kind of trouble. I'm probably on the run, as you put it, but not in the way you think, I said. Then I told him my story about my whore wife who wanted to put me in the cleaners and how I could use some time to live. I haven't robbed or killed anyone. I'm just trying to keep what is rightfully mine. I just thought that if you had a place where I could set up for the night, I would repay you with my labor. I'll pay my own way, and if you don't find me useful, tell me, and I'll go on my way without any hard feelings. He stood up and searched my face with his eyes. Son, if what you're telling me is true, I'd be a fool not to at least give you a chance. But I must tell you at once that the Wilsons are trying to get me to sell them my land. They haven't done anything wrong yet, but I wouldn't stand in their way. Perhaps you're biting off more than you can chew. I told him I was willing to take the risk. He asked if I had any ranching experience. I answered honestly that I'd spent a few summers at my uncle's place in Texas, but I'd never been a cowboy. He extended his hand and we shook it in agreement. He asked me to call him Bill, and I introduced myself. We went back to the diner where his wife was waiting for us. Colleen, this is Carson Jones. He'll work for us if he can handle it, Bill said. Colleen rose from her chair and held out her hand. I took it in mine. It's very nice to meet you, Carson, she said. Her voice was clear, perhaps with a slight hint of an Irish accent. Like her husband, she was trim and slender. She was a very beautiful woman. Nice to meet you too, Mrs. I realized that Bill hadn't given me his last name. Buckman. Last name is Buckman. But you just call me Colleen. There's no formality in this part of the country. I immediately took a liking to this nice lady. Bill told me I could follow them to the ranch. Before leaving town, he stopped at a store, got out of the car, and I joined him. I thought you might want to pick out some clothes suitable for ranch work, he said. Yeah, you're right. I don't think what I brought with me is going to last, I replied, grateful that he'd thought of that. I followed him inside, where he was warmly greeted by the store owner. It was obvious that Bill was a regular customer. 40 minutes later, I had enough jeans and work shirts for a week, along with a coat and a pair of Western-style riding boots. That was enough for the first time. It was nearly 25 miles from the store to the main gate, which bore the name Rocking Bee Ranch above it. That was his trademark, Rocking Bee. It was another mile down a private road to the main house. Their two-story house stood on an elevation. It was well-maintained and looked freshly painted. Behind the house, you could see a barn and a few outbuildings. The pickup truck they were driving was partially filled with grocery bags, and I figured it was probably their weekly trip into town for groceries. Stopping behind them, I stuffed my hands full of bags and followed the Buckmans into the kitchen. 2 trips, and we unloaded the truck. Bill told me to drive back, and he would show me where I could camp for the night. I stopped and saw that he was standing in front of a small shack. When I got out, he said I could use that shack, and pointing to one a few yards away from me, said Sam was using it. He said Sam was on his rounds now, and I would meet him later. Bill waited while I unloaded the stuff. The cabin was one large room with a bed along one wall and a table and 2 chairs along the other. There was a wood stove in one corner. There was also a bathroom with a single stall shower. It lacked sophistication, but it was clean. It was a suitable place to sleep for the moment, and hopefully Janice wouldn't find it. When I got back outside, Bill was sitting in his pickup truck and told me to hop in. He took me for a ride around the ranch. He had almost 6,000 acres of land, 5,000 of which was fairly level and made good pasture. There were several hundred acres where he grew winter feed. The back of the ranch was hilly and forested. Farther out were mountains with a creek flowing down from them that crossed the property. He said that this area could only be traveled on horseback. I learned that he used to have 3 full-time employees, but hard times came and Sam was left alone. He had been working on the ranch for 30 years. During rounds, when they were calling cattle to send to market, he would hire extra help. It was 5 o'clock when he drove me to the little shack. By the way, I noticed you carry a laptop with you. I have a satellite link to the router so you'll be able to get online without wires. Dinner is at the main house and we usually eat at 6, he said before pulling away. It took me less than 30 minutes to get my stuff laid out. That left me time to boot up the computer. Just as Bill had said, I was able to establish a wireless connection. I quickly checked my email. I had created a new account, and there was one email from Jake. He said that if he had any news about Janice, he would let me know. Apparently, she had reported me missing to the police, and they were investigating my disappearance. That gave me something to think about. Jake was the only one I'd really told I was leaving, but even he didn't know where I was going, nor did I at the time. I mailed my resignation letter to my former employer, but I didn't tell him in person. Shortly before 6, I walked up to the main house and knocked on the kitchen door. Bill beckoned me in. I stepped inside and saw Colleen setting food on the table. Bill was standing in the distance talking to a man who I realized was Sam. Bill invited me to come over. "Sam, this is Carson, the new hand I told you about, at least for today. We'll see how he feels about it tomorrow after a few days of work," Bill said with a wide grin. "Carson, and this is Sam." Sam gave me a beaming smile and held out his hand. He was a big man. He was at least 6 feet 3 inches, and like Bill, he looked like he'd worked hard all his life. He looked to be about the same age as Bill. One more thing, he was African American. I shook his hand and felt the strength in his grip. "Well, young man, I hope you like it here." "I could use the help," he said. "I think at 28 I was about half his age, so he thought I was young." "I'm going to do my best," I replied. Just then, Colleen told us to sit down as dinner was ready. Bill and his wife sat at opposite ends of the table, so Sam and I stayed seated between them across from each other. On the table was a large platter of pork chops, a large bowl of mashed potatoes, and another with fresh string beans. There was also a plate of obviously homemade cookies. "We don't have much flavor here, Carson," Colin said, "but there's plenty of food and it's hearty." My mouth watered. "It looks great," I replied. The food was passed around and our plates were filled. Everything looked very appetizing. Colleen was a good cook. As we ate, I asked Bill if he had lived here all his life. "Yes, my grandfather started this ranch and passed it on to my father. Now it belongs to me and Colleen." Bill paused as if pondering. "When I was younger, though, I wasn't sure she'd be a part of it. I had to fight off all the men in 3 counties together." Bill looked at his wife, and I could see in his eyes the depth of his love for her. "Now, Bill, you know you're the only man I've ever looked at. I just had to make sure you wanted me enough," Colleen said. "My wife was responsible for 3 of the happiest days of my life. The day she agreed to marry me, the day she married me, and the day she gave birth to our daughter, Caitlin," Bill said. I saw no sign of a daughter, and Colleen must have read my curious look. "Our daughter is away right now. Caitlin is pursuing her Doctor of Veterinary Science degree at South Dakota State University. She was only able to come home for the vacations, and we are looking forward to seeing her come home with her degree. She is expected to be home in a couple months," says Colleen. "It will be nice to have a veterinarian in the family." "It will help cut down on some expenses," Bill added with a grin. After dinner, I tried to help put the dishes away, but Colleen said that was her job and shoved me off. Bill told me breakfast was at 5:30 and we'd start work at 6. As Sam and I were leaving, I noticed a copy of today's New York Times on the counter. Bill must have picked it up while he was in town. I asked him if I could borrow the front page, and he said yes. As soon as we left the house, I asked Sam if he could come into my cabin for a minute. We went inside, and I pulled out my digital camera and showed him how to use it. I asked him to take a close-up picture of me holding the front page of a newspaper. I realized he was wondering why I wanted the picture, but he didn't ask. He asked if I had an alarm clock, and I assured him I did. He said he would see me in the morning and left. I downloaded the photo to my computer and then pasted it into an email with a note to the police in my former hometown stating that I was alive and well and had left the city of my own free will. Had I used the local newspaper, it would have given an idea of where I was. As it was, I could have been anywhere. I emailed Jake and asked him to stop by one of the local coffee shops that had free internet access. I figured my work email was still active, so I gave him my password. That way, he could forward my original email and picture to the police, and it would leave no trace to track me or him. That way, I hoped the police wouldn't put me on some FBI list or National Missing Persons list. I didn't think they would spend a lot of resources looking for a runaway husband. I slept soundly that night. The next morning, I got up at 5 a.m., showered and dressed to head to the main house with Sam. There were eggs, sausage, hash browns, and toast for breakfast. There was enough for everyone. After we ate, Bill told Sam to take me and put me to work replacing the fence posts on the hilly property. I followed Sam into the barn, and he pointed out the horse and saddle I would need. Sam watched me closely as I put the saddle on the big brown mare. The days spent at my uncle's ranch had paid off as Sam seemed pleased with my work. Then we took the 2 mules and put saddlebags on them to load the fence posts and the whole digger. Bill came out to the barn with a Model 94 Winchester in a saddle sheath. He told me it was mainly in case we came across a cow that needed to be put down. It didn't happen often, but it was best to be prepared. Sam and I jumped on our horses and, leading the mule behind us, set off. We followed the creek up into the hills. As we drove, Sam and I talked and got to know each other better. I told him about how I ended up in Montana. I didn't think he would give me away. He told me about his own experience. He got married right out of high school and found his ex-wife in bed with another man. In a fit of rage, he almost beat the guy to death. He served 5 years in prison, and when he got out, Bill was the one who hired him. That's how he ended up here for the last 30 years. He went on to tell me that he thought only good things about Bill and Colleen. They were the salt of the earth. In the rays of the rising morning sun, the mountains in the background were breathtaking. It was early April, and the snow on the lower elevations had already melted, but there was still snow on the peaks. Once we reached the tree line, the trail began to climb upward. It was another half hour before we came to the fence marking the property boundaries. Sam pointed out that not all the posts needed to be replaced, but only the ones that had rotted or were close to it. That was about 1 in 3. He stayed with me while I installed the first 2 to make sure I was doing it right. Sam said that if I worked until about 4, I would have time to come back and take care of the horse and mules and have supper at 6. He concluded by telling me to follow the creek down and not get lost. Sam headed back, and I was left alone with my work. There is something soothing and peaceful about this beautiful, hilly, wooded area. I worked along the line, pulling out old poles and installing new ones. At noon, I took a break and pulled out of my saddlebag the pork chop sandwiches Colleen had handed me this morning. They were left over from last night's dinner and were just as good today. While I ate quietly, I watched a blue jay flying between the trees. A woodpecker made a brief stop and tapped on a tree looking for food. Then a white-tailed doe appeared in the gap on the other side of the fence. She walked forward until she caught my scent. She snorted and disappeared into the trees, waving her tail in the air like a flag. I finished my sandwiches and went back to work. I set the alarm on my watch, and it rang at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I saw that I had set all the posts except for a few that were being driven by mules. Leading the mules behind me, I headed back along the fence line until I found the creek and headed down the slope. Just before I left the trees, there was a natural pool where the creek flowed in and out. I stopped and admired the view that opened up. The upper stream was falling from a 10-foot-high ledge into the clear waters below. I realized that this was the most beautiful and peaceful spot on the ranch. I got back to the barn just in time to saddle the animals and feed them. While I was there, Sam went into Stoas's horse, and when I told him I had set all but 2 of the poles, he seemed surprised and impressed. We had just enough time to wash and change our clothes to get dinner on time. We had steaks that night. Bill was visibly impressed when Sam told him about my progress that day. I was very busy and hardly participated in the conversation at the table. As soon as dinner was over, I bowed out and went straight to bed. I slept soundly. Damn, I was in so much pain when I woke up. My arms were sore from working with the whole digger. So were my arms, shoulders, and legs. I thought I was in pretty good shape since I worked out 4 or 5 times a week, but there's a big difference between a 2-hour workout and a full day of work putting up fence posts. When I limped into the kitchen and grimaced as I sat down, Bill and Sam chuckled a couple times. Even Colleen tried to hide a smirk. I was hungry, however, and put the food away. "Are you ready for another day of fencing?" Bill asked as we rose from the table. I groaned. "Yes, sir," I said, hoping my words sounded more optimistic than I felt. Bill laughed at me again. "I think you can rest today. I'd like you to go for a ride with Sam." I nodded gratefully. The first job of the day was to clean out the stalls and put in fresh hay. We took the horses and mules out to pasture and filled their feeders. Only after that did we load into the pickup truck and drive to the range. Mostly we checked to see if there were any fallen cows or calves that had become separated from their mothers. The excursion Sam took me on was much more extensive than the one I went on with Bill on my first day on the ranch. Sam seemed to know instinctively where the cattle would be and how many would be there. I guess after 30 years on the job, it came natural. We got to the far end of the ranch, and Sam stopped the truck and looked around. Something on one of the hills caught his eye, and he pulled out his binoculars. He held them out to me and pointed to where I should look. It took a minute, but finally I could make out 2 calves, and it looked like they were alone. "Where are their mothers?" I asked. Sam pointed to 2 cows near the tree line. "That's them. Their cubs must have wandered into the trees, gotten lost, and moved on. We'll have to bring them down." "Are we going to walk there?" I asked. "No, that's too far. We'll go back and harness a couple horses." The pickup trucks were equipped with radios, and Sam called Bill and told him what we had seen and that we were on our way to get the horses. When we got back to the barn, Bill had already saddled the 2 horses and loaded them into the trailer. All we had to do was harness them up and hit the road. Sam drove us pretty close to the tree line below where the calves were. We unloaded the horses and headed for the mountains. The 30 years Sam had spent here made itself felt again. He knew this country like the back of his hand. Half an hour later, we were behind the calves and slowly starting to move them down the hills. It made me laugh when we cleared the trees and the straggling youngsters noticed their mothers. They ran screaming to their mothers and immediately looked for a nipple to feed. The larger cows stood patiently and let their babies feed. I couldn't help but think that if I had run away from my mom, I would have gotten my ass kicked when I got back instead of a teat. That night for dinner, we had fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. On the platter were breasts, legs, and thighs cooked to perfection. I had more energy that night and talked more than the night before. I learned more about Colleen. Her parents immigrated to the United States from Ireland when she was 5 years old. Her father had always been fascinated by stories of the Old West and had come to Montana. That explained the Irish accent. She grew up in America, but her parents' influence was still felt in her speech. The next day I felt much better, and after breakfast I set out again to change the fence posts. Sam helped me load the mules, but I set out alone. All I had to do was to follow the creek to my destination. This day was easier than the first. I learned a few tricks that made the work less strenuous. Shortly before 4 o'clock, I set the last pole and headed back to the barn. I had some free time, so I washed a few stalls before cleaning up for dinner. On the 4th day, I helped Sam repair some of the buildings, and the next day I installed new fence posts. The next 2 months went by quickly. Now I took turns going to the pasture and checking on the cattle. I was in the best shape of my life. We had a set schedule. Sam rested on Saturday, Bill rested on Sunday, and I had Monday off. That was the day I did laundry and ran into town if I needed anything. I loved everyone on the ranch. Sam was good-natured and malleable. We often sat and talked after dinner. I had a lot of respect for Bill. He was honest and hard-working, and we got along well. Colleen was very nice to Sam and me, but I could see that she had some fire in her. She and Bill were a great couple. Colleen and Bill were already excited. At breakfast on Friday, Colleen told me that her daughter would be home in a week. That afternoon, it was my turn to take the horse and ride through the wooded area, checking to see if the cattle had wandered into the hills. It was a little after 4 I got to the creek and turned around to follow it downhill. When I reached the pool below the waterfall, I stopped and sat down on the ground. I took off my shirt and knelt down next to the water. Dipping my bandana into the cool water, I began to wash the sweat and dust off my face and neck. I heard a whiny downstream and looked to my right and saw a horse and rider approaching. At first I thought it was Colleen, but I quickly realized it was a younger version of her. This beautiful woman could only be Caitlin. She had the same crystal blue eyes and red hair as her mother. She pulled up and stopped a few feet away from me, and I stood up and faced her. She looked me over, and I saw her gaze stop on my bare chest. 2 months of hard training had taken its toll on my taut muscles. "Who are you, and what are you doing in this territory?" she snapped back in a haughty tone. "My name is Carson, and I work here," I replied. "I don't believe you. My father said he couldn't afford to pay for the other hand," she said. Despite her beauty, I was a bit annoyed by her unfriendly tone. "Yeah, I've heard that too. That's probably why I laugh all the way to the bank every day when I get my paycheck." Caitlin glared at me, turned her horse around, and kicked it in the side. I watched as she disappeared from sight. Grinning to myself, I put on my shirt, got back on my horse, and continued toward the barn. I later learned that there had been a misunderstanding between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she would come home the following week. Instead, to my parents' surprise, she arrived a couple hours after I left. She spent the morning and the first half of the afternoon with her parents until she told them she wanted to go for a ride, something she didn't have time for at school but loved to do. She got in the saddle and rode to her favorite place, a waterfall and a pool of water. I guess after 2 months I became old news and Bill and Colleen forgot to mention me. As I rounded the barn, I saw the redhead disappear inside. I ducked down and led my horse inside. Caitlin must have been looking for her father and finally found him in the barn. I could clearly hear her loud voice. "Who is the man who was at the waterfall?" she asked. Bill thought for a moment. "It must have been Carson," he replied. "He said he works here. But last time I was here you said you couldn't afford to pay another employee. Well, he's right, he works here. And as for how much he gets paid, I guess that's none of your business. This ranch still belongs to me, young lady. Daddy, he says you pay him so much that he laughs until he falls over," she whispered. By now, I had entered the barn. Caitlin had her back to me and didn't see me. Bill, on the other hand, did and smirked. "It's true, Carson. If you think you're overpaid, I can fix that," he told me. Caitlin turned and fixed her gaze on me. I pulled my hat off with one hand and scratched the back of my head with the other. "I'd hate to take advantage of you, Bill. How much are you going to cut my paycheck?" I asked. At that, Bill and I both burst into laughter. Caitlin, not understanding the humor, stared at both of us. "Honey, so you can get rid of that bee as soon as possible, Carson is going to live in the cabin next to Sam's house," Bill said. "And what else?" she still demanded. "And he'll also eat your mother's exquisite cooking. So you say you're not paying him?" "Why would he work for nothing?" persisted Caitlin. "He has his reasons, and it's not for me to explain them to you," Bill said. "Working for a chance to taste Mom's cooking is worth a lot. I don't think she'd like it if you said it was nothing I cut in." Caitlin gave me another glance and scurried out of the barn. Bill shook his head. "She reminds me so much of my mother when she was little. I didn't think I'd be able to tame Colleen." That night at dinner, Caitlin joined us. She sat next to Sam on the opposite side of the table from me. When I entered the kitchen, she gave me another sharp look. I waited until everyone had filled their plates before I spoke. "Your mom told me you got your doctorate in veterinary medicine," I said in a pleasant voice. "Yes," she answered without raising her eyes. "Sam says there is only one veterinarian in the area and he is more than 50 miles away. I'm sure you'll be a great asset to the people of this neighborhood." Caitlin looked up at my compliment and I thought her eyes softened a little. "Yes, that's Doc Harrison," said Colleen. "He has more cases than he can handle and he's often needed in several places at once. I agree with you, Carson. Our Caitlin will be able to do him a great favor." During the rest of the meal, Caitlin talked to her parents and Sam, who had been at the ranch since before she was born. She didn't address me directly, and I was mostly silent. It was her homecoming, and I knew her parents and Sam wanted to know what had been going on in her life while she was gone. As soon as I finished eating, I went to bed. When I got back to the cabin, I checked my email and saw that there was an email from Jake. He reported that he had spoken to a friend of his who was a police officer and asked in passing if they had reported me missing. His friend said that everything was dropped after they received the letter with the picture I had sent them. As for Janice, Brandon had apparently dumped her as soon as he found out I'd disappeared with all the money, and it didn't look like Janice was going to get any of it anytime soon. Of course, she couldn't afford to pay the rent on the house we were living in, and was now squatting in a shabby apartment, moonlighting as a waitress. She didn't have the money to hire a lawyer to prosecute me. I found that ironic. Apparently, she had only married me for the money, and her boyfriend only wanted her for the same thing, my money. I was still working on replacing the fence posts. I was now doing this about every third or fourth day or so. I had moved beyond the hilly area and was now able to get to the job site by pickup truck. Loading the poles into the back of the truck was much more convenient than on the mules. The next morning after Caitlin came home, I loaded the pickup with poles and drove to where I was staying. When it was the usual lunchtime, I headed to the truck and realized I hadn't brought lunch with me. If any of us were going to be working away from the main house all day, Colleen had to make sure we had lunch, and I didn't seem to have time to take mine. I could have driven back to the house in my car, but decided that skipping one meal wouldn't kill me. About a half hour later, I was just setting up the pole and attaching the wire when I heard a vehicle approaching. When I turned around, I saw that it was one of the ranch trucks. The truck stopped just as I finished with the pole. I turned around and was surprised to see Caitlin getting out of the truck. She was holding a small bag like the ones Colleen used to put our lunches in. "Mom said you forgot your lunch," she said, pushing the bag toward me. I reached out and took it from her. "Thank you, Caitlin. That was very kind of you," I replied. Looking into the bag, I saw that it contained 2 sandwiches as usual. I pulled one out and offered Caitlin the second one, but she shook her head, refusing. I shrugged and sat in the back of the truck to eat. Caitlin came over to me, stood about 5 feet away from me, and just stared at me. I just sat there and ate, keeping my eyes on the road. "Why are you here?" she finally asked. I turned and looked at her and decided to mess with her. "You don't have to tell anyone. I robbed a bank and hid the money. I'm hiding here until the heat dies down and I can get the money." Her eyes widened first, then she stared at me. "You're a real clown," she muttered and turned to walk away. I waited until she was halfway to her truck. Caitlin, when she heard me say her name, she stopped and turned around slowly. "I married a woman who never loved me and only wanted what I could provide for her. I ended up here because I just wanted to get away from everything I knew for a while." Caitlin stared at me again and seemed to think I was telling the truth this time. She nodded her head and left without another word. As she drove away, I thought about what her father had said about her mother being like Caitlin when she was the same age. He'd said he'd managed to tame Colleen, but I suspected the secret lay in their love for each other. It had been less than 24 hours since I'd first met Caitlin, and I couldn't imagine any man taming this fiery redhead. Dinner that night was pretty much a repeat of the previous night. Caitlin chatted with her parents and Sam. I didn't feel offended. After all, she didn't know me, and we had nothing in common. We were just finishing dinner when there was a knock on the door and Bill went to open it. He was followed into the kitchen by a man about my age. He was, as women say, tall, dark, and handsome. Caitlin excitedly called out the name, jumped up from her seat, and hugged the guy. It was obvious they knew each other. They chatted about how long it had been since they had seen each other. A few minutes later, there was another knock on the door. Bill went and opened it, then came back with another man. He was blonde-haired and handsome. Caitlin greeted him just as warmly. I remembered Bill's words about having to fight off all the men in the neighborhood to get a wife. Caitlin was as much a prize as her mother, at least outwardly. I left the table and went back to my quarters. Mentally, I wished the 2 guys good luck. I envy them, though. If Caitlin turned out to be as much of a woman as her mother had been, whoever won her favor would be the lucky one. The next day, I picked up the phone and drove to the range. By the time I made my rounds, I felt like something wasn't adding up. It was early enough that I went back for Sam, and we took a whirlwind tour of the ranch. There were a lot of cattle scattered around the ranch, but he agreed that something was off. It seemed like we were missing a few head. We decided that the next day we would get in the saddle and ride through the hilly terrain. That evening at dinner, we discussed it with Bill, and he agreed with our plan. It was raining that night, which would make it difficult to find tracks. The next morning, we loaded the horses into the trailer, and Bill drove us to one end of the property. I drove about a third of the way to the tree line, and Sam drove another third. Then we headed across the ranch, over the hills, and through the trees. It took most of the day to get to the far side. We counted 5 stray heads. Bill met us as we came out of the hills, and we loaded the horses on the trailer and headed back. We discussed the situation and decided that the only thing we could do was to be more vigilant. That night at dinner, Caitlin was approached by another suitor. I heard her mother mutter something about it being the 3rd suitor of the day. She'd heard rumors that she'd come home and guys were flying from their seats to get her attention. For the next 4 days, we spent a lot of time observing the herd. Everything seemed to be in order, except for the supposed initial loss. Caitlin continued to be visited by callers. She had been home for a week and hadn't said a word to me since the day she brought me lunch. On the 5th day after the supposed disappearance of the cattle, I told Bill that I wanted to drive the property line through the hills. We had already circled the entire fence line along the pastures and had seen no sign of the missing cattle passing through there. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch. This is where Bill's ranch bordered the Wilson Ranch. About halfway to the southwest corner, I noticed 3 fresh horse tracks. They were crossing from Wilson's side to Bill's side. What was surprising was that the fence wire was still up. I dismounted and checked the fence posts and saw that the braces on 5 posts had come loose and were barely holding the wire up. Removed the staples and lowered the wire, and you could get to the other side. Put the wire and staples back in place, and everything was back to normal. I got on my horse again and followed the trail. As I neared the creek, I saw 3 horses tied to a tree just above the falls. They were still about 30 yards away, and I quickly got off my horse, tied it to the tree, and took my rifle out of its sheath. I crept quietly between the trees, fumbling from side to side with my eyes. When I reached the horses, I saw boot prints leading downstream. I crept to the edge of the waterfall, looked back, and ate. There was Caitlin lying in the pool. I was mesmerized by the sight. Movement in the trees to her right brought me back to my senses. I quickly scanned the area and saw 1 guy to my right and 2 others approaching the pond on my left. I raised my rifle and fired. The bullet hit between the legs of the guy on the right. Another quick pull of the trigger, and the dirt exploded between the 2 guys on the left. Caitlin let out a piercing scream that echoed through the trees. I stood up where everyone could see me. "Now on your stomach." "I won't miss the next punch," I yelled. "Caitlin, stay where you are." Caitlin didn't see the 3 men. She only saw me standing over her with a rifle in my hands. "You're crazy, Carson!" she screamed. She tried to cover herself. One of the men on my left flinched as if he was about to run. The bark on the tree next to his face exploded as I pulled the trigger again. He made sure of it and fell flat. Caitlin looked over to where I had fired and saw the 2 men. She cried out again. I set on their bellies. 3, 2. Before I could say 1, the other 2 went down. "Now put your faces in the dirt and your hands behind your head." They complied with the order again. "Now come out, Caitlin, and get dressed." "But Carson," she began to protest. "Damn it, Caitlin, just do what I tell you to do. Get dressed and get out of here," I growled at her. Caitlin was clearly scared, and you could see her trembling from my seat. But she did as I ordered and stepped out of the pool. Like Venus rising from the sea, she stepped out of the water. Even though her back was to me, I couldn't take my eyes off her. The sight of her alabaster skin and the most perfectly rounded ass I had ever seen was forever imprinted on my mind. All she did was put on her jeans and shirt and jumped up on her horse. 1 kick, and she disappeared into the trees. When she was gone, I ordered the men 1 by 1 to get up on the dais and lie back down. Only when all 3 lay before me did I breathe the sigh of relief. I decided it was time for a bluff. "So what am I going to do with you 3? I paused for empty effect. "I guess I could just shoot your balls off and watch you bleed to death." The 3 men began to beg me to save their lives. I smelled the distinct scent of shit. At least one of them had shit in his pants. "Even if I don't kill you, Caitlin's father will when I tell him how you were going to rape his only daughter. The only thing I can think of is if you have something you can confess to the sheriff that was more important. Say stealing cattle. It might result in jail time, but at least you'd stay alive." The smallest of the 3 broke down. "Yeah, we did it. Wilson said if he could break Bachman, he could get his land. One of them told him to shut up." "Screw you. I'm not going to die because of stupid cows," the little guy muttered back. I knew Caitlin would ride as fast as she could to find her father, and he would come to find out what had happened. In the meantime, I decided to just wait. Sure enough, 45 minutes later, Bill and Sam came into view. I waved at them and they raced toward the top of the falls. "What the hell is going on?" asked Bill from his place atop the horse. He looked down at the 3 men lying face down on their stomachs. "Looks like someone from Wilson's arm decided to pay us a visit." I followed their tracks from the fence line to this spot. Caitlin was bathing and these 3 were trying to sneak up on her. I walked over to my captives and put the barrel of my rifle to the little guy's neck. "I think this one has something to tell you." I gave him another nudge. "We did it. We took some of your cattle." "But it was Wilson who made us do it," he wailed pitifully. Bill tipped back his hat and smiled broadly. "You know, when my grandfather started this ranch, they used to just hang horse thieves and cattle thieves. I guess that was justice. Too bad we have to be civilized these days." Sam kept an eye on the uninvited guests while Bill and I talked quietly. We decided to send them back downstairs. Bill and I followed them with rifles in our hands as they walked ahead of us. Sam tied their horses and walked behind them. When we got to the buildings, we led them into the barn, put them in separate stalls next to each other, and made them sit. With the stall doors open, we could see them, but they couldn't see each other. Bill went to the house and called the sheriff, and Sam and I stood guard. Less than half an hour later, a sheriff came rushing down the mile-long road. I got out and talked to him and Bill, and we told him what had happened. I suggested that I take the little fellow out first and let the sheriff talk to him. He agreed, and I quickly took my prisoner outside. The odor left no doubt as to who had pissed his pants. He seemed to doubt his confession and refused to talk at first. It seems to me, Bill, that all we have here is a simple trespass case. I'm wasting my time dealing with it. I guess I can just leave them here and forget I ever saw them at all, and you can do as you see fit, the sheriff said. The little rustler's eyes widened with fear, and he suddenly spoke. The sheriff soon learned the truth. He called for reinforcements, and soon a string of sheriff's cars lined up at Wilson's ranch. Wilson's ranch covered nearly 16,000 acres, but the sheriffs knew where to look. The corralman told them what part of the ranch they kept the stolen cattle. In all, they found nearly 100 head, with the Rocking Bee branding. Before the day was over, Wilson and his associates were behind bars. With all the excitement, we didn't sit down to dinner until after 9. Caitlin sat down at the table but kept her eyes on the plate in front of her. "What were you doing there?" asked Bill, as he had not had a chance to speak to her. "I was just swimming. I didn't think anyone would spy on me." At those words, she threw me an accusing look. "First of all, Caitlin," I began, "I wasn't spying on you. I followed the trail of their horses to the creek. And second of all, what do you think would have happened to you if I hadn't been there? I don't think those 3 guys were going to have a picnic with you when they saw you swimming naked in the pool." Caitlin's face turned bright red. "Thank God you made it in time, Carson," Colin said. "I hate to think what might have happened." Everyone dropped the subject, and we hurriedly started eating. We still had to get up early in the morning. I walked out of the kitchen to my quarters and was halfway to them when Caitlin called out to me. I stopped and waited for her. "So, did you like the view today?" She snapped at me rudely. It was probably too much to think she might actually be grateful. Let's just say I'd be lying if I said it didn't take my breath away. Caitlin only let out a poof and turned on her heels, stomping toward the house. I stood there shaking my head. I guess there was something about me that was just pissing her off. The next day, Bill had to go to town to formally press charges against Wilson. It would be several days before we could move the stolen cattle to where they were supposed to be. The prosecutor had to document everything first. Sam and I spent the day applying a fresh coat of paint to some outbuildings. We had lunch in the kitchen, but Caitlin didn't join us, which was fine with me. Bill returned early in the morning, but waited until after dinner to tell us what had happened. He told us that since the case did not involve the death penalty, Wilson and his hands would be released on bail. He didn't think they would try anything again, but he asked us to be on our guard. Bill looked at his daughter and smiled broadly. "If you're going to be swimming naked anytime soon, maybe you should take Carson to watch over you. I mean, have him watch you," he said with a chuckle, teasing Caitlin. Caitlin's face turned bright red again, and she hissed, stood up, throwing her chair back, and ran out of the room. Bill and Sam burst into laughter, and even Colleen giggled. I couldn't keep from giggling myself. When everyone had calmed down, we continued eating. Bill didn't stop teasing, though. "I really want to thank you, Carson. Wilson could have eventually gotten the ranch into financial trouble. You're definitely worth every penny I pay you." We all laughed amicably. 3 days later, Bill got word that he could get his cattle back. We loaded the 3 horses into a trailer and drove to the main gate of Wilson, labeled Flying W Ranch. We were escorted by the sheriff to the area where the angry cattle were isolated. Colleen went with us to drive the truck and trailer back as soon as we unloaded the horses. Bill, Sam, and I started corralling the cows back to the ranch. I felt like I was in a western during a cattle drive. When we pulled up to the Rocking Bee Ranch, I rode up front and loosened the fence line so the cattle could get over it. Once all the cattle were back on the correct side, we put the fence back in place and drove back to the main house feeling satisfied with the day's work. Caitlin applied for a license to become a practicing veterinarian. Since it usually took about 45 days to get it, all she could do was care for the animals on her father's ranch. Occasionally, I would see her outside and, of course, at the table during meals. She still looked at me silently, but if I managed to catch her eye, I grinned widely and raised my eyebrows. It was always enough to make her blush. It was 2 weeks after the incident at the waterfall when we happened to be in the barn at the same time. "Been swimming lately?" I said, wiggling my eyebrows meaningfully. Caitlin walked over to me, stood a few inches away from me, and stared at me. "Why are you being such an asshole?" she snapped back. I shrugged and grinned. "Why are you being such a bitch?" I replied. Her right hand started to swing at my face, but I was quicker and grabbed her wrist before she could slap me. She tried to slap me with her left hand, but I caught her wrist again. I put both hands behind her back, pinning them there. This made her body press against mine. Slowly, I lowered my face to hers and stopped when my lips were only an inch away from hers. Caitlin looked up at me with widened eyes, but didn't resist. "If you were my woman, I'd put you on my lap and spank your pretty little ass," I whispered. Caitlin let out a loud sigh. "You wouldn't dare," she said, trying to pull away. I let go of her suddenly, and she fell backward, landing on her cute little ass. "It's not that I don't dare. It's just that I just got rid of one woman who doesn't care about me, and I'm not going to waste my time on another." So far, Caitlin had always been the one to leave. This time it was my turn. I walked out of the barn, leaving her sitting on the ground with her mouth open. I didn't see her until after dinner. She didn't speak to me, of course, but I noticed that she was looking at me with some incomprehensible gaze. Not that I ever claimed to understand women. I think my marriage to Janice proves it. The next day I was in the barn cleaning the stalls when Bill came in. On Sunday, when he took Sunday off, I knew he wasn't here to work. He must want to talk. I wondered if Caitlin had told him about what had happened the day before, and he came over to tell me to leave. I stopped as he approached. "I understand you and Caitlin had a little spat yesterday," he said. Well, that confirmed what she'd told her father, but I noticed a glint appear in Bill's eyes. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." "It's probably all my fault," I said. Maybe not. I think her problem is that she doesn't know what to do with you. At first, she thought you had to be here because you needed something. Then you became the hero who saved her in the ranch. But she can't understand why you don't run after her like all the other local young men. Caitlin, like her mother at her age, is used to guys circling her. She had a few boyfriends, but they never lasted long. I don't think she had any respect for them. I just hope you don't let her drive you away. In my opinion, you can stay here as long as you want. Thank you, Bill. That means a lot to me. As for Caitlin, I'll stop teasing her, and hopefully we can live and let live," I said. Bill walked out of the barn, and I continued my work. I had the rest of the day to think about what Bill had said. If Caitlin wanted to figure me out, she should have behaved politely and just talked to me. As for stalking her like the other suitors, that wasn't going to happen. Caitlin didn't join us for dinner that night, which no one mentioned, and I certainly didn't ask. The next day I got up at 5 as usual, even though it was my only day off. It was easier for me to stick to the same schedule, so I never slept late. I had breakfast, and after Sam and Bill went to work, I went and got my laundry. Bill had bought a big commercial washer and dryer. I could wash all my clothes in one load. The laundry room was next to the kitchen, so while the laundry was being washed, I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee. Colleen and I were talking at the table when Caitlin walked in. She rarely ate breakfast with us and ate later. "Any plans for today?" Colleen asked me. "Actually, I was thinking of going into town." "Do you want me to pick you up?" I asked her. "Well, if you don't mind, you could buy a couple things for me." "I don't mind at all," I said. "Can I go into town with you?" said Caitlin. I looked up in surprise. "It's just that I was going to go to the store to get a few things, and we're both going to have to spend gas to get there," she said, as if she needed to justify her request. "Sure, I'd love to give you a ride," I replied, still surprised. After yesterday, I hadn't expected her to talk to me, much less want to go somewhere with me. "I'll be leaving in about an hour and a half after I finish my laundry and put things away." "Okay, I'll be ready," Caitlin said. She finished preparing her food and sat down at the table but stayed silent while Colleen and I chatted. Caitlin must have been watching me because she came out the back door as soon as I left my cabin. She looked gorgeous in a turquoise sundress that highlighted her red hair. The straps supporting the dress left her arms and shoulders bare. Her skin was flawless. Unlike many redheads, neither Caitlin nor her mother had freckles. When she glided toward me, it was the definition of grace. As she crossed the yard, she kept her crystal blue eyes on me. I was sure she was making sure I was watching her. I opened the passenger's side door for her and watched her climb in. We got behind the wheel, and for the first half of the drive, she sat in silence, admiring the countryside. "I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday," she said suddenly. I glanced at her but couldn't see her face as she was looking out the side window. Well, while it may not have been an unpleasant endeavor, I have a rule about not imposing unwanted caresses on unresponsive females. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her turn her head and stare at me. Caitlin sat quietly again, but I kept seeing her looking at me. I pulled up to the store and we went inside. I needed to buy a couple new jeans and shirts. Caitlin had a list of things her mother wanted to buy, and an hour later we had everything loaded up. I had one more stop to make at the hardware store to pick up a few things for Bill, but it was getting to be lunchtime, and I was getting hungry. I suggested we stop for a snack, and Caitlin agreed. I stopped at the very diner where I first met Bill and Colleen. We sat down at a table across from each other and ordered our food. We sat in silence again, and I began to think that I should have just stopped at the hardware store and then gone straight back to the ranch. At that moment, the door opened, and 3 men entered the room. 2 of them I recognized as the guys who'd come at Caitlin's call. They made their way to our table, 2 of them taking seats on either side of the table, and the third stood behind me. They ignored me and started talking to Caitlin. I stood up and told the third to take a seat. I caught Caitlin's gaze as I moved to the next table. I called to the waitress as she brought our food and asked her to put mine in front of me. I ate quickly, ignoring the conversation at Caitlin's table. I tossed a few bills on the table to pay for our meals and stood up. Caitlin had barely had time to eat and her plate was still full. "I'm going to make a run to the hardware store. I can stop by here later and see if you're ready to go," I said, stepping into the conversation. Caitlin pushed her plate away and stood up. "No, I'll come with you. It was nice to see you guys again, but we have to run," she said. The guys at the table tried to protest. One even offered to give her a ride home. She just told them no and followed me to my SUV. I pulled up to the hardware store and got out of the car. She stayed in the car and seemed to be on edge. She stayed that way as we drove back to the ranch and turned off the highway and into the mile-long driveway. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" I replied, not understanding what she meant. "Get up and go sit at the other table." "Oh, that. I figured you'd rather spend time with your friends. Besides, I didn't want to be in the middle of their fight for your attention." "You really are an asshole," she snarled. I prudently kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to fight off her slaps while I drove. I pulled up to the main house, and as soon as I opened the back door of the SUV, Caitlin grabbed everything she could carry. I picked up a few more bags and followed her retreating figure into the house. When I walked in the back door, she dumped everything on the kitchen table, and without a word to her mother, left the room. Colleen looked at me questioningly. I shrugged and said, "I guess I'm an asshole." Colleen giggled, walked over and put her hand on my shoulder. "I've never seen anyone have as much influence on Caitlin as you have," she said in a low voice. "I guess I was born to just piss her off," I replied. "I'm not sure about that," she replied, leaving me confused. I went back to the cabin and put away my new clothes. Not wanting to stay cooped up in the small cabin, I headed to the barn and saddled my horse. I rode out and ended up at the top of the waterfall. It was a nice day, so I tied the horse to a tree and sat on the edge of the waterfall, looking down at the clear pool. I'd been sitting there for half an hour, maybe more, when Caitlin rode up to me. She got off her horse. Not wanting to be accused of peeking at her in case she was about to take another dip, I picked up a rock and threw it down, making a splash in the water. Caitlin looked around for the source of the noise and spotted me. I expected her to gallop away, but instead she got on her horse and galloped to where I was sitting. She tied her horse next to mine and walked over to me. I stood up and took a few steps away from the edge in case she was going to push me off it. "You're an asshole," she said, stopping a few centimeters away from me. "And you're still a bitch," I said. This time I didn't wait for her slap. I wrapped my arms around her waist and kissed her. Just as quickly as I grabbed her, I let her go and tried to move toward my horse. Her hand grabbed my arm and spun me back around. I was stunned when she reached for my neck and pulled me into another kiss. "Let's go swimming," Caitlin whispered. Caitlin rested her head against my shoulder, and I held her until the coolness of the water forced us out. In silence, we dressed, got on our horses, and rode back downstairs. We put the horses in the stall, and Caitlin came over to me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me again. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the main house. In a day, as I walked back to my cabin and slipped into the shower, I stood under the jets of hot water and pondered what had happened. One thing I realized, I had much stronger feelings for this beautiful woman than I had ever admitted to myself before. I had just enough time to get dressed for dinner. When I walked into the kitchen, Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already there, but Caitlin was nowhere to be seen. We were just taking our seats when she walked in. Instead of taking her usual seat next to Sam, she sat in the chair next to mine. Bill and Colleen stared at her, and Caitlin just smiled sweetly back at them. During dinner, Caitlin chatted away. Despite her parents' curiosity, they didn't ask why their daughter was in such a good mood. After dinner, Caitlin helped her mother clean up the kitchen, and Sam and I went back to our quarters. I had just managed to slip between the sheets when I heard a quiet knock on the door. In my boxers, I opened the door, and Caitlin slipped inside and enveloped me in a hug. We kissed softly, and she led me back to the bed, where she threw off her clothes and joined me. We made love again, and then fell asleep in each other's arms. 5 in the morning came all too quickly, and I reached up and slapped the alarm clock, turning it off. Caitlin was still snuggled against me and let out a light groan at the intrusion of the sound of my clock. It was only with great effort that I was able to tear myself off the bed. I turned on the bathroom light and got dressed. I walked over to Caitlin, kissed her gently on the top of her head, and slipped out of the cabin. At breakfast, I couldn't help but notice the looks Bill and Colleen were giving me. I wondered if they knew where their daughter had spent the night and was still lying there. After breakfast, I went out and loaded up the pickup truck to spend another day installing fence posts. When you work alone on a ranch, there's a lot of time for reflection. I thought about my old life and marveled that it had only been 3 months since I had left my wife. It seemed like a lifetime to me. I thought about Bill, Colleen, and Sam and how much they had come to mean to me. And then I thought about beautiful Caitlin and what we had shared the day before. I wondered if it was possible for me to find the love that her parents shared. During lunch, I realized that I had forgotten to bring my lunch with me again. At that moment, I heard a pickup truck coming toward me. It stopped, and Caitlin jumped out and came running toward me with a bag in her hands. She pounced on me and ran her tongue down my throat. "Mom said you forgot your lunch." She giggled. To hell with lunch. I pulled her to me and kissed her again. I didn't get to set up as many fence posts as usual that day, but I still bumped into her a couple times. We had a little time to talk. I told Caitlin all the details of my former life and how my slut wife used me. Caitlin told me that she was afraid I was going to leave. "Caitlin, all I can say is that I'll only leave if you tell me to," I told her. Caitlin finally came home and I finished my day. I went back to my quarters, showered, and changed. This evening she was in the kitchen when I walked in and again took the seat next to me. In the middle of our meal, there was a knock on the front door and Bill went to answer it. He returned, accompanied by the same guy who had first called out to her. Caitlin stayed in her seat and looked at him. "I was wondering if you wanted to go for a ride," he said. In this part of the country, people had nothing to do, so take a ride was a euphemism for a date. "I appreciate your offer," Caitlin said, "but I don't think my boyfriend would like it." She leaned over and kissed my cheek. Mr. Tall, dark and handsome, blushed and hissed, then walked out of the house. Now everything was out in the open. I looked at Bill and Colleen and saw smiles of approval. Even Sam was grinning widely. We had become an official couple. After a few days, the local men stopped dropping by Caitlin's place. She had made it clear to them that she was not for sale. I found one way to help Caitlin. She was trying to get a loan from the bank to buy the equipment she needed to start her veterinary business. The bank didn't want to give her an unsecured loan, and the only way to get one was to ask her father to put up the ranch as collateral. She didn't want him to do that. I asked her to give me a couple days to find out how she could get a loan. I contacted my offshore bank and asked them to open an account for me in the name of a dummy loan company. I had Caitlin fill out a loan application on my computer and submit it electronically. I set it up so that it would actually come to my email. I waited a couple days and sent her a notification that her loan was approved and a money transfer would be made to her account. Caitlin was thrilled with the news, but asked why the annual interest rate on the loan was only 2%. I told her it was a non-profit philanthropic group that gives loans to people they believe are doing community service. I could have just offered her the money, but I knew she was too proud to take it. She had worked hard to get her degree and was determined to succeed through her own efforts. By the time she received her license, she had bought a new van, which she equipped as a mobile veterinary clinic with the necessary medical instruments. As soon as it became known that she had obtained a license, many local ranchers began to seek her services. Caitlin often spent nights with me in my cabin. Of course, Bill and Colleen knew about it, but they didn't seem to mind. She was 27 and old enough to make her own decisions. It was 3 months before the case of Wilson and his hands went to trial. The case was virtually dismissed. Little turned himself in and received 2 years probation with no jail time. Wilson had 5 other men working for him who each received 5 years in prison. As the organizer of the theft, Wilson received the maximum 10 years and a $50,000 fine. When Wilson was sent to prison, I began making inquiries about him and his ranch. He was single and had no family in the county. With all his men in jail, there was no one to run the ranch. So I came up with a new plan, but before I could put it into action, I had to finish the old business. I had to get a divorce. But there was no way I was going to let Janice have half my money. To do this, I turned to my buddy Jake and enlisted his help again. Instead of email, I called him. I asked him to talk to Janice and tell her that he had heard from me and that I wanted to offer her a settlement in exchange for the divorce. The amount of the offer was $50,000. If she didn't accept the offer, she would never hear from me again or get any money from me. At first, she tried to feign innocence and demanded to know why I left and why I wasn't coming home. It ended when Jake told her that I knew all about her boyfriend Brandon, and her plan to divorce me. Janice realized her game was over. She was still working as a waitress and struggling to make ends meet, so she accepted my offer. To do that, I had to go back to Texas and hire a lawyer to drop the papers. Caitlin was not happy when I told her I was leaving. I explained to her that I needed to close this chapter of my life and promised her that I would be back. I had planned to go to the airport and leave my car in a long-term parking lot, but she insisted on driving me and wanted to be there for me when I returned. I think the fact that I was leaving my SUV and all my stuff except what I took with me in one suitcase made her feel a little better. I flew out on Sunday and Jake met me at the airport when I arrived. I stayed with him, his wife, and 2 kids. Of course, I called Caitlin every night. By Friday, I had all the paperwork done. Jake took Janice to my lawyer. He explained that she would receive a check for $10,000 now and the balance of $40,000 in 60 days when the divorce was finalized. He showed her the check, which would be kept by him until the judge made his ruling. She signed the papers and my attorney gave her a check for $10,000. I never got to see Janice. I thought about the things I had in storage. There were mementos and heirlooms I had inherited from my mother and father, as well as yearbooks and other things I wanted to keep. I decided I didn't want to go back for them, so I rented a moving van and loaded it up. Caitlin just freaked out when I told her I wasn't flying back. I had to calm her down, and when I explained that I was taking everything I cared about, she was happy to have me back. It took me 3 days of hard riding to cover 1,600 miles. Tuesday evening, I pulled up to the Rocking V Ranch. Everyone greeted me with enthusiasm, and that night, Caitlin continued to greet me until early morning when we fell asleep with no energy. Now, I was ready to put the rest of my plan into action. To do this, I had to make several trips to the prison where Wilson was being held. I wanted him to sell me his ranch. He didn't agree at first, but I kept making my case. He would spend at least 7 years there before he would be eligible for parole, even with good behavior. He will have no one to run the ranch, and by the time he is released, his house and buildings will likely be in ruins. His cattle will probably be dead, and there will be no one to feed them in the winter. So I asked him if he thought he would be welcomed back after his sentencing. This was cattle country, and cattlemen didn't complain about rustlers. When he realized he was in danger of ruin, he accepted my offer. At least this way, he would have something to start his life with after his release. The next thing I had to do was to find funding. I transferred my money back to the country. I was sure Janice wouldn't risk her $40,000 by doing something stupid. I got Wilson to agree to a price of $5 million. It was worth a lot more than that, so it wasn't hard to find financing. I put in $500,000 and financed the rest. It took me a month to do the whole thing. I hid from everyone what I was doing. It was hard to do, but I told Caitlin and Bill that I had personal matters related to my assets that I had to take care of. It really only took 1 or 2 days a week. I formalized myself as a corporation and registered the land in my name. Summer ended and fall came. I was able to hire a man to harvest the hay that was growing on the property. I also hired 4 laborers to live on the property to manage it for the time being. The most experienced worker was appointed temporary foreman. I explained to him that I would be the absentee owner for a while, although I would be very close by. He would always be able to reach me by phone, and I would visit the ranch often. The last thing I was up to was remodeling the main house. It was a 2-story, 5-bedroom house, but it needed to be modernized. Even though Caitlin was getting annoyed with me for not telling her exactly what I was doing when I left, our relationship was still thriving. I knew that my love for her was growing every day, and I felt that she felt the same way about me. As for herself, her veterinary business was doing very well. True, she had to travel a lot, but she was happy. It almost got to the point where I told her what I was doing. I had just gotten back from a renovation and she had me cornered. "What the hell is going on, Carson? Are you seeing someone else?" she demanded. "God, no! I swear there's no one else. It's just that I have things I have to take care of. Please believe me. I promise I'll tell you everything soon. I love you, Caitlin. I'm asking you to trust me. Trust in our love." Caitlin studied my face, searching for the truth, and her eyes softened. "Okay, Carson, I trust you, but you better tell me what's going on soon or I'll kick your ass," she said. I grabbed her and kissed her with all the love I had. It was spring and the beginning of calving season when the main house renovations were completed. It was time to put the last part of my plan into action. One afternoon, I waited until Caitlin was alone. I asked her to go for a ride with me. "Honey, I've been thinking it's time for me to leave Rock and Bee Ranch," I told her with a serious face. Instantly, her eyes began to water. "But Carson, you promised you wouldn't leave," she said, cocking her chin. I timed it so that we were at the entrance to the former Flying U Ranch property. There was no sign above the gate now. I turned off and took the private road. "Well, I wasn't going to go far," I said. Caitlin looked around confused. I'm not sure she heard what I said. "Carson, what are we doing on Wilson's land?" I procrastinated until we pulled up to the main house. "Come on, I want to show you something." I got out of the car, walked around, and opened the door for her. Taking her hand, I led her to the front door and opened it. "Carson," she hissed, "what the hell are you doing? We could get in trouble for this." "Relax, honey. Wilson doesn't own this ranch anymore. Let's take a look around. I want to know what you think of the house." Caitlin stared at me and shook her head, but let me walk her through the house. I led her upstairs and we walked through the bedrooms and then back downstairs. There was a large living room, a paneled den, 2 rooms set up as home offices, and finally the kitchen. I could tell by the look on her face that she liked the new kitchen. There was only 1 room in the house with furniture, and that was the one I was going to use for my office. The rest of the house was waiting for her to decide what she wanted. "What do you think of the house?" I asked her. "That's very nice," she said. "Do you think you could live here?" "Damn it, Carson! What the hell is going on?" I could see she was confused and upset. I dropped to one knee and slipped my hand into my jacket pocket. "Caitlin Wilson no longer owns this ranch. It belongs to me. I'm asking if you could live here. Could you live here as my wife? Is this your property?" she asked, eyes wide. I nodded. "Yes." Then I pulled my wedding ring out of my pocket and held it out. "Caitlin, I love you with all my heart. Will you be my wife?" Caitlin's face shrank and her eyes filled with tears. At first I thought I had made a mistake until she flopped me on my back and covered my face with kisses. "Yes, Carson. Yes, I will marry you," she shrieked. Our next kiss was full of passion. Then Caitlin held out her finger for me to put the ring on it. Caitlin looked around the house with new eyes. She started running from room to room again, looking at everything around her. I waited patiently for her to return to my arms. "The house is beautiful. I really like it," she said enthusiastically. I led her across the room to 2 doors leading out into the hallway. "There are 2 offices here, one for you to conduct your business and one for me," I said. That earned me another long kiss. I led her into an office with a desk and pulled out a large piece of paper. It had a gate drawn on it, and above it was written Double C Ranch. Caitlin looked at it, and her eyebrows furrowed. "What's a 33?" she asked. "That means Carson and Kathleen's ranch. I saw the light bulb come on." "My God, it's beautiful!" she exclaimed. She began pulling off my clothes, and I joined in undressing her. When we were naked, I sat her down on the desk and christened the study our lovemaking. In the days that followed, we made love in every room of our house. When we recovered and got dressed, I told Caitlin it was time to go tell her parents. She was so happy that she seemed to swim to the truck. We got back a few minutes after 6, and Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already in the kitchen making dinner. We walked in together, and Caitlin raised her left hand. "We're getting married," she squeaked. Colleen jumped up and rushed over to hug her daughter, and Bill and Sam came over and started swinging me by the arm and pounding my back. Then I was hugged tightly by my future mother-in-law, and Caitlin hugged her father and Sam. When everything had calmed down, we sat down at the table. Caitlin waited until everyone had eaten. "Of course, that means we'll be moving," she said as nonchalantly as possible. "What? Bill?" Colleen and Sam exclaimed in one voice. "Tell them, sweetie," Caitlin told me. I nodded. "Well, Bill, you know that Wilson wanted to combine his ranch with yours? I thought it would be a good idea," I said. Bill stood up with a furious look. "No way in hell flying who was getting my ranch," he growled. I laughed. "Bill, calm down. This isn't the Flying W anymore. It's Double C Ranch, and the new owners are sitting at your table right now." "What the hell are you talking about?" he shouted, now completely confused. "I bought Wilson out, and now the ranch belongs to Caitlin and me," I explained. "Double K, Carson, and Caitlin," Colleen said. She understood immediately. "Bill, I was thinking that if we combined the two ranches, you could run them. We'd split the profits 50-50, I added. "But the Flyer, which is Double C, is twice the size of my ranch. It's much more profitable," he said. "Bill, you've been doing this your whole life. I need your help. I want us to be equal partners. You'll be in charge of operations. What you say will happen. Besides, it's part of Caitlin's ranch. It'll keep everything in the family," I explained. Bill sat up and looked at Colleen. She nodded her head. Bill reached across the table to me, and we shook hands. "Damn it, Carson. This is going to take some getting used to, but I accept your offer. It means we'll have more labor, which means Sam will be the head foreman," I said. Then I groaned. "And now I'll have to pull out all those fence posts I worked so hard to install on this side of the lot." Everyone laughed. Dinner that night was a noisy and raucous feast. Caitlin spent the night in my quarters and wore me out. The next morning we were late for breakfast, but were still in the kitchen when we walked in. They were waiting for us to eat so we could go to Double C and Caitlin could show off her new home. Everyone was impressed, and I saw Colleen looking at the updated kitchen with envy. It took Caitlin and her mom a month to furnish the house. It was ready for our wedding night. We were married in Double C Bill, and his family were respected and loved, and ranchers and their families from miles around came to celebrate the day. As Caitlin's husband, Bill's son-in-law, and the new owner of Double C Ranch, I was welcomed into their community. By the time we got into bed, it was late, and we stayed there, making love all night and most of the next day. We would have stayed there, but on the third day of our marriage, I took my bride to Fiji for a tropical honeymoon. Our first roundup that year bore good fruit, and we sent a lot of cattle to market. We made a good profit. Most of it went to pay off the loan, but along with Caitlin's business, we were making good money. We even built a new house for Sam, and now he has a girlfriend close to his age who lives in town. We'll probably have another wedding soon. Another year has passed, and my beautiful wife has just given me the most fantastic news. She's pregnant. We're having a baby. We are on our way right now to tell the future grandparents. One last word before I go. I know there will be those who will say that I should have learned my lesson the first time and gotten Caitlin to sign a prenup. If that's the case, then you don't know my Caitlin. She's not Janice. She gives her best at her job and also takes care of our house. She is her mother's daughter, and she shares her love with me every day. With me and only me. Every day when I look into her blue Irish eyes, I see that love. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.